And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Art Blakey's Life and Times and Best Hits. Art Blakey was one of the greatest drummers from the 30s. He started out as a pianist and then in the 30s switched to drumming. Some of his notable stints were alongside Fletcher, Henderson and Billy Eckstine in the 40s. He was known as the volcano of jazz. He was also one of the pioneers of the hard bop era. He went on to found the Jazz Messengers, which featured names like Horace Silver, Wayne Shorter, Lee Morgan and others. Some of his notable collaborations were alongside Thelonious Monk, Gordon Dexter, Sonny Rollins and others. He was one of the most influential drummers in jazz, hallmarked by a great dynamic swinging style and a signature press roll. He contributed greatly to the evolution of jazz in the 40s and 50s. He started out as a bop enthusiast, then in later years his style became more varied. He also helped redefine the role of a rhythm section in hard bop bands of the 50s. So that was some insight into the biography and best hits of Art Blakey. More details coming up. Also coming up, some trending music news. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Art Blakey, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about his biography. Art Blakey was born in 1919. He started out singing in church choirs. He mastered the piano at an early age. In his teens, he switched to drums. In his teens, he was performing at a gig when a chance encounter with Errol Garner showcased his ability as a drummer. This turned into a lifelong passion for drumming, a career that spanned over 6 decades. As an emerging drummer, Art Blakey was tutored by Chick Webb. In 1937, he formed his own group and toured and performed in Pittsburgh alongside them. His Pittsburgh stint was his first foray into the jazz world. In 1937, he saw another notable stint alongside Fletcher Henderson. The same year, he toured with Billy Eckstine, Charlie Parker and Sarah Vaughan. Art Blakey had a unique rhythm and drive to his drumming that set him apart from his peers. His styles were varied and included a blend of hard bop, behop, gospel, blues and straight-ahead jazz. His drum solos helped pioneer the behop era. In the late 40s, he formed his first big band, the Jazz Messengers. This was a band comprising a 16-piece orchestra. In 1954, he recorded his first album alongside the Jazz Messengers live at Birdland for Blue Note Records. Collaborating with him on the album were some top-notch players like Horace Silver, Lou Donaldson, Clifford Brown and others. The album also went on to become a blueprint for hard bop music in later years. Throughout the years, the players in his band, the Jazz Messengers, came and went, but the Jazz Messengers remained a mainstay for several years. Some of the notable players who played alongside the band over the years included Wayne Shorter, Lee Morgan, Bobby Timmons and Jimmy Merritt. They produced some timeless classics in the 50s and 60s, songs like Timmons' Moanin', Along Came Betty and Blues March. Most of these songs were original compositions by the bandmates. By the mid-60s, the Jazz Messengers had become a nationwide jazz band. They also toured nationally and internationally in Europe and Africa. In 1960, they became the first American jazz band to perform live in Japan. In the 70s, there was a tendency in the jazz scene to shift into fusion and electronic territory, but the Jazz Messengers were one of the few bands that maintained their style of straight-ahead jazz. Art Blakey went on to inspire countless other musicians, from Wallace Roney to Mulgrew Miller to Donald Brown and more. He died on October 16, 1990, leaving behind a legacy as one of the greatest drummers in jazz. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Art Blakey's life and times and best hits. Now it's time for some trending music news. So there's a great new series of jazz books for aspiring jazz musicians. It's up for release by educational foundation MDEX Music. The books are all about the art of mastering jazz classics. The books incorporate a staggering 1,500 jazz classics with tips and tricks on the art of harmonization, improvisation and melodic development. The book is up for purchase on mdex.com. The books include the Jazz Standards Progressions book. This one talks about the harmonic structure of jazz standards, chord progressions and scales. The Jazz Standards Guide Tone Lines book is all about voice-led improvisation. The Jazz Standards Upper Structures book teaches the reader how to use chordals to create modern angular voicings over jazz chords progressions. And the Jazz Standards Target Notes book, which talks about the art of creating great improvisation lines by emphasizing on specific notes. So this is a great comprehensive book series for jazz musicians. For more information, please visit mdex.com/jazzstandards.phtml. So that was some trending news about a jazz book series on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of Art Blakey's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Art Blakey, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first one's called A Night at Birdland, released in 1954. This album was recorded when Blakey's band, the Jazz Messengers, were in their early days. It was recorded at the famous Birdland Jazz Club in Manhattan. One reason these albums were significant was that they were recorded with the new emerging technology at the time. There's notable contributions from Lou Donaldson and Clifford Brown. Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers with Thelonious Monk was released in 1957. Art Blakey and Thelonious Monk, a great jazz pianist, frequently collaborated. Many critics said Blakey's style was a perfect accompaniment for Monk's piano style. They'd appeared on several albums together. Most of the compositions here are Monk's works. There's also contributions by John Griffin, a leading tenor saxophonist. The album hallmarked a time when both Monk and Blakey were carving a niche for themselves. Something Else was released in 1958. This album sees early pioneers of jazz like Art Blakey and others contributing to a great Cannonball Adderley album. Many of the tracks are inspired by Miles Davis, whose typical cool jazz style is also reflected in Blakey's drumming. He's more relaxed and laid back in his playing. The ensemble enters with some beautiful spacious music. The tempos are relaxed and the moods are very reflective. So that was some insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We are going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Art Blakey, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Night at Birdland, released in 1954. This album was recorded when Blakey's band the Jazz Messengers were in their early days. It was recorded at the famous Birdland Jazz Club in Manhattan. Another reason these albums were significant was that they were recorded with a new emerging technology at the time. There's notable contributions from Lou Donaldson and Clifford Brown. The album sees them take on some amazing covers of classics, from a great rendition of A Night in Tunisia and Confirmation to some great drum rhythms on The Way You Look Tonight. The song Once in a While sees Clifford Brown weaving in and out of the melodic lines with great ease and gentleness. There's a great tune called Blues, which is one of Horace Silver's improvised tunes. The song went on to become a hard bop classic. On this track, we see some great solos by Clifford Brown and Lou Donaldson. The songs Wee Dot and Quicksilver featured some great momentum by Art Blakey, also some great solos by Curly Russell. Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers with Thelonious Monk was released in 1957. Many critics said Blakey's style was a perfect accompaniment for Monk's piano style. They had appeared on several albums together. Most of the compositions here are Monk's works. There's also contributions by John Griffin, a leading tenor saxophonist. The album hallmarked a time when both Monk and Blakey were carving a niche for themselves. This album was the only time Monk recorded alongside the Jazz Messengers. However, Blakey and Monk were long-time collaborators. One of their early notable albums together was Genius of Modern Music, Volume 1, released in 1951. Even before this performance, Blakey had already seen a stint drumming alongside Monk on the album Monk's Music, released in 1957. Three of the highlights from the lineup: tenor saxophonist Johnny Griffin and trumpeter Billy Hardman. Monk steps in as guest pianist with a vibe perfect for the overall swinging melodies that run throughout the album. One of the highlights was Johnny Griffin's saxophone playing. It was said of Monk's compositions that saxophone and trumpet players especially had a hard time playing his songs, but Griffin shines in this regard. In fact, sometimes Monk would ask him to step in for the great John Coltrane, one of the greatest trumpeters in jazz. His style is dazzling on the album Jazz Messengers with Thelonious Monk. One of the tracks, Purple Shades, is one of his own compositions. The other 5 tracks are by Monk. Songs like Evidence, Invoked But, Blue Monk, I Mean You, and Rhythm in Me. Something Else was released in 1958. This album sees early pioneers of jazz like Art Blakey and others contributing to a great Cannonball Adderley album. Many of the tracks are inspired by Miles Davis, whose typical cool jazz style is also reflected in Blakey's drumming. He's more relaxed and laid back in his playing. The ensemble enters with some beautiful spacious music. The tempos are relaxed and the moods are very reflective. This album is very much in the style of the famous Miles Davis album Kind of Blue. Also, the lineup on this album sees several of the same players from that performance. There's Davis on trumpet and Cannonball Adderley on saxophone. The rhythm section features Hank Jones on piano, Sam Jones on bass, and Art Blakey on drums. The album is a hallmark of Miles Davis, switching from upbeat to nostalgic. The opening track, Autumn Leaves, is a very introspective track and one of Miles Davis' best songs. The soft bluesy saxophone playing is one of the highlights. There's a similarly nostalgic version of the classic Love for Sale. It's also almost completely based on improvisation. The song starts off soft and gentle and builds into a wild conclusion. The closing track, Dancing in the Dark, sees Cannonball Adderley doing a great imitation of Charlie Parker on saxophone. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Art Blakey, his life and times and best hits. Now it's time for some trending festival news. Every year, the International Montreux Jazz Festival takes place on the shores of Switzerland. Since its inception in 1967, the festival has seen performances by legends like Etta James, Miles Davis, Kendrick Lamar, Bob Dylan, and others. Initially, the festival was exclusively about jazz music, but in later years it expanded to include other genres of music as well. Today, the Montreux Jazz Festival annually welcomes more than 250,000 visitors and artists every year, in a festival that celebrates the spirit of jazz music and more. The Montreux Jazz Festival Miami is the second edition of the festival. This year, the Miami edition of the Montreux Jazz Festival will be taking place on February 28th to March 2nd at the Coconut Grove in Miami. Some of the top names from the festival include John Batiste, a Grammy Award-winning singer and songwriter who will be performing on the opening day. Also, Grammy Award-winning singer, songwriter and rapper Janelle Monáe will be headlining the festival on Saturday, March 1st. La Descarga is taking the stage on Sunday, March 2nd. Other performers from the lineup include Chaka Khan, Willow, Alfredo Rodrigo, and more. For more information, please visit www.montreuxjazzfestival.com/en/. So that was some trending festival news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Art Blakey's best albums of all time. Stay tuned.